is the requirement that some sort of prime mover exist in order to explain the existence of anything. So this gets us into our next one here. If you are not familiar with the Latin ex nihilo, that's out of nothing. So some physicists and cosmologists have contended that the Big Bang can and did originate from nothing. They will contend that since the meeting of matter and antimatter produces a state of nothing, the reverse should also be possible, that nothing can, in fact, spontaneously produce matter and antimatter. This explanation on a conceptual level, regardless of what they say the math and physics will support, on a conceptual level, this is a twofold problem. Firstly, there is almost no antimatter in existence today, and it is maintained by these physicists and cosmologists that none of what little antimatter exists today is still there from the origin of the universe, as stuff that it just spontaneously comes into existence by the meeting of cosmic rays, or in incredibly, incredibly tiny amounts has been produced in some particle colliders. For nothing to be able to create unequal halves in this matter-antimatter equation is impossible unless that nothing that physicists and cosmologists are referring to is in fact something. And when you get into these theories and you see debates and stuff where some of these individuals have been questioned, you quickly figure out that they're not actually talking about nothing. There is not agreement on what that definition is. Again, if I ask you to define nothing, what is your answer? You'll find out they'll be talking about magnetic fields, energy, and other things that are interacting to then create matter. Well, I don't think any serious physicist is going to maintain that energy is a nothing. And of course, you also have the problem of they're saying this equation would work in reverse so that nothing can create something, except when matter and antimatter meet, you don't in fact get nothing, you get a tremendous amount of energy because 100% of your mass is converted into energy. So you don't have a actual reverse operation that can be backed up in this case to claim that you got something out of nothing. So this is ultimately an improperly written equation. Never mind, it's an unbalanced one. So again, by our definitions, you cannot get nothing out of something, whatever twisting and contorting some may wish to do to try to argue that you can. So you still have to have an answer to the question, how did nothing become something? And again, in our context, in our argumentation, the answer to that question is, you have God. Another argument for God is from our own reason, rationality, and logic. And I don't mean that we are able to argue it so. I mean that those things exist in the first place. So here's a brain teaser for you. What is reason and where did it come from? Oh, and by the way, you're not able to use God as your reason. I'm seeing a few stumped-looking faces here. So, by the principles of science, and like I said, it was a little bit difficult to figure out which order to put last week and this week's class in, and it still winds up very much being two sides of the same coin. But by the principles of a science that espouse that the universe came from nothing without cause and that everything until now is just a series of phenomena explainable by the principles of physics, chemistry, and biology, molecules reached a point of random combination that spontaneously gave rise to life. The term for this is abiogenesis. Again, science will maintain that over time, these random combinations continued on, giving rise to increasingly complex life until you get to humans billions of years after this process started. This explanation gives absolutely no explanation for or reason to trust in your own capacity for reason. We can conclude from our senses, for example, that drinking funny-smelling water may make us sick, and making decisions around such things can make sense in the context of our origin being by abiogenesis, as those organisms that fail in such decisions are less likely to survive. But what about things like mathematics, physics, any of the more complex endeavors of mankind? None of those are necessary for survival, at least long enough survival for procreation and being able to see that the next generation continues on. A hunter-gatherer level civilization can accomplish that. Reason isn't really explicable in an abiogenesis context, which presents the problem, and again, this is a very condensed way of putting it, and I kind of debated whether or not to include, because it takes a little bit of time to understand and really break down. But in the abiogenesis context, there is no, again, pardon the repetition of the word, there is no reason to anticipate that we would have a reason within us, a capacity for reason within us, that is something that can be trusted. Because after all, this process is a series of long, random happenings, according to what science will maintain, that happen to just produce you and I the way we are and sit today. The universe doesn't have to be explainable, studyable, or measurable for biological life to continue existing. In fact, we can see that by this plain and simple fact of we're the only species that does that sort of thing in the first place. You have how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of different species out there that continue completely along on their merry way without any capacity or necessity for reason. So there becomes the question of, why is it that that is something that came to exist in humans? There's another problem, and this goes back to our entropy problem. On top of there's no reason to expect that the capacity for reason and rationality would be produced by an abiogenesis explanation, we have the problem that in the human genome, there are errors that have been propagating, and there are certain negative conditions, genetic conditions, that are becoming more common with time. Moreover, the recent studies are indicating that with the Industrial Revolution improving human nutrition across the board, we have seen a rise in IQ over the last century or two, but that is now plateaued and is in decline. There is data to suggest that before the end of this century, the average IQ is going to be below 70. And if you are not familiar with that number, 70 is, and I know this is a term many do not like, but I'm using it in the medical sense, 70 is kind of the threshold as to whether or not someone is considered retarded. So, the idea that the universe can hold entropy and this kind of decay at bay for millions or billions of years in order to build up human consciousness, but now it's all sliding off and in decay again, isn't a logically consistent explanation. This is another one that abiogenesis cannot make account for, and that's our argument from aesthetics. Consider the subject of beauty. Anybody want to tackle those questions there? What is beautiful? What is the best color? What is the best music? Anyone brave enough to answer that question, any of those questions? Now, many of these things can break down into the category of personal preference, and so you may find at times that if this sort of subject comes up, the unreligious may wish to deflect of, there is no answer to this question, it's just a matter of personal preference. Yet at the same time, you're not going to find a serious person who was going to tell you that a pile of dung is more beautiful than a Rembrandt. So clearly, beauty is a thing which exists, and even once you remove personal preference out of the equation, doesn't make it stop existing. So personal preference is not the sum total of the explanation of beauty existing. But the interesting thing is, in a survival context, the Rembrandt can be argued to not have any clearly definable value, while the pile of dung as fertilizer could be the difference between crop failure and death, or a successful harvest and continued existence. So again, if this has all been built up by the various random biological and chemistry and physics processes of the universe with the sole aim of continuing existence, there's actually a case to be made that something that is considered beautiful, that we should be more predisposed to see that pile of dung as beautiful than the Rembrandt. Writing, poetry, painting or sketching, writing or performing music, and even if you don't have the inclination towards any of those things, almost everybody at least still has the capacity to recognize and enjoy the beauty in those things. And pursuing all of those endeavors, which usually somebody has at least one of, even if you are not somebody who can write poetry, many will still enjoy reading it. Even if you can't write music, people will still enjoy listening to it. All of those things that are considered beautiful do not have any sort of direct utility towards a survival context. Now, you may get somebody that's going to argue about, well, this is necessary for psychological well-being, but the question comes back to, is psychological well-being, it's only necessary up into a point as far as the propagation of genes and the continued existence of humanity. So, I want to make it very clear, because we did talk last week about the God of the gaps. This question of aesthetics isn't something that is simply lacking an explanation that science has yet to discover. The question about aesthetics is not a God of the gaps. What has been claimed about the origin of life as an explanation by science, this idea of abiogenesis, runs counter. The things that explanation would purport are the way things are, runs counter to these sort of things, writing, poetry, music, etc., existing in the first place. And really all that ultimately can be argued in that Darwinian concept is some nebulous idea of, well, these things arose because they somehow contributed to humanity continuing to exist and flourishing. We're going to get a little bit more deeply into this next section next week. If you look at our syllabus, the next week is going to be on moral law, or why does God allow suffering. But just as a brief cover for this week, as far as does God exist, there's next the argument for morality or ethics. Those are not exactly the same thing, but for the purposes of our discussion are interchangeable for now. In a Darwinian context, there is no utility to cooperation beyond the barest of minimums. The rising of such ethical and moral systems as Christianity, Judaism, or any other religion that will espouse the same conduct toward friend and family as it does toward foreigner and stranger is completely antithetical to the Darwinian model. In the Darwinian model, the most fit survive. Temujin, which maybe you don't recognize that name, but he's better known by a name you will know, Genghis Khan, had the better part of 1,000 children. and is currently estimated to have 16 million male descendants alive today carrying his Y chromosome. That is 0.5% of the world's entire male population and around 8% of the male population of that region of the world in Asia. His 1,000 children did not arise from conditions that any person in a modern Western civilization would consider moral or ethical. I don't think I need to be as distasteful as to explain to you what we're talking about there. He is also estimated to be responsible for around 40 million deaths, or around 11% of the world population at the time. Proportionally speaking, he is likely the deadliest man in history. Mao was potentially responsible for a few million more deaths than Genghis Khan, but there were also many times more people alive on the earth under Mao than Genghis Khan. So in a Darwinian context, Genghis Khan is perhaps the most successful human to have ever existed. A lot of competition was eliminated, and there is probably no person, unless we're going to go all the way back to Adam and do that argument, or Noah and his family, there's probably no person who has as many direct descendants. So, from nature alone, how do you make the case that any of what he did was wrong? How do you make the case that going and trying to be the next Genghis Khan isn't what you should be doing? Yet instinctively, almost everyone, religious or not, is going to look at the example of Genghis Khan and say that there is something incredibly wrong with that picture, almost instinctively, and that we should not accept that he is the model for how one should conduct their life. It could be argued that the prevalence of Christianity in the West over the last couple of thousand years has meant that we just all have deeply entrenched moral ideas that have been created by our culture that make us say no to that sort of thing. But the question is still begged: if Darwinism is right about the origin of the human body and psyche, how did those Christian ideas even originate in the first place? So a little bit of a thought experiment for you, drawing this point out to conclusion. So Christians facing the lions in Rome with prayer and song while going to their deaths, in a Darwinian context, shouldn't have been a powerful symbol that sways more and more to believe if survival of the fittest is the paradigm. The early Christians repeatedly would have shown themselves as unfit to survive. If there is no soul within humanity that has been given aspects that lead it and point it back towards God, how do you account for the sympathy followed by conversion that the martyrs of the early Christians resulted in? Again, this is not a God of the gaps of we can't just explain it yet. The current explanations based on naturalism and materialism alone tell us the exact opposite outcomes should have been the case. We should be a world ruled of Genghis Khan types, not a world where Christianity, if you combine its various denominations, is the dominant world religion. Lastly, on our arguments for the existence of God, we have arguments from evidence. And there's a quote here from my Philosophy 101 book. The first part of that book was very brief. It was just, what is philosophy? The second, and probably about the biggest individual section of that book, is specifically on the question of God. And of course, there were quotations from a whole number of philosophers on both sides of that equation. But that section opened with this quotation from Anthony Kenny: "If there is no God, then God is incalculably the greatest single creation of the human imagination. No other creation of the imagination has been so fertile of ideas, so great an inspiration to philosophy, to literature, to painting, sculpture, architecture, and drama. Set beside the idea of God, the most original inventions of mathematicians and the most unforgettable characters in drama are minor products of the imagination. Hamlet and the square root of -1 pale into insignificance by comparison. So after all is said and done on the question of the origin of the universe, the nature of our consciousness, the things we value and are capable of, we come at last to the countless people throughout history who have claimed some manner of experience from God. Moses in the burning bush, Adam and Eve in the garden walking and talking with God, Isaiah before the altar in heaven, miracles, healings, signs. Some we believe, others, such as the angel messenger in a cave to Muhammad, we do not. The simple question to answer is this: is this evidence of some god or gods, or is this merely the product of human imagination? The critic is going to point out that a bunch of the things that I just listed are contradictory. Islam and Christianity, for example, cannot both be true. Many religions don't account for this issue, that they all are essentially offering competing explanations. Their significance, I would argue, is more, as religions, is more so cultural than it is spiritual. Christianity and Judaism before it, however, both do account for this problem. Because there is God, but there is also an anti-God, a deceiver, a devil, one who desires no one to worship, acknowledge, or seek to serve God. The seemingly contradictory evidence in our understanding and explanation is by design. That may not necessarily be convincing to people that you will encounter, but it is evidence that is an explanation that is consistent with evidence. Now, that it may result in the protestation of an individual of, okay, so you've accounted for this, but which of these explanations are true? Sadly, that is material we will be getting into in future classes. I'm not going to be offering, full explanation today. But again, everything that I've gone over so far this morning in terms of these explanations, we've gone over the problems that exist in the world's explanation to how all this came to be. There are issues of inconsistencies and contradictions within those explanations that are not present within the explanation we're offering. So, in conclusion, as Mark Twain famously said, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics. On the points we have gone over today, the question essentially is, what do you think is more likely? Is it more likely that the universe sprang out of nothing, or that a being that transcends the laws and workings of the universe had a hand in it? Is it more likely a world controlled by entropy, constant decay towards being too spread out and cold for life to exist, built up humans, and more importantly, human consciousness and intelligence? Or did a creator who desires a relationship and interaction with his creation make mankind and their intellect precisely for such interaction? And if you believe that God and religion are in fact the invention of the confluence of these million and billion year processes, you must either claim rejection of religion because it's arbitrary and meaningless, which makes your own intellect and consciousness equally arbitrary and meaningless, or you at least still have to hold religion as the pinnacle of human development, as it is the most common and powerful element of human development and civilization. So even if you're going to go down that road of God doesn't exist, you still have not been able to do away with religion. Which is, you will find oftentimes the very thing that the atheist will be arguing for is that religion is something that is completely and utterly meaningless, worthless, and should be done away with because there is no God. But going back to that quote by Anthony Kenny, it's like, even if that is the position you're going to maintain, that there is no God, the very idea and the inspiration and the guidance that that has provided to humanity makes it the single greatest achievement of humanity. And so you are arguing to do away with the single greatest thing that humanity has achieved, if that is your position. We have a couple of minutes. I know this was kind of a lot to take in. Any questions or comments here to go over before we conclude this morning? Brother Terry isn't here this morning to give me a hard time on anything. Well, now that that is all clear as mud, we will be a little bit on and off. So next month, of course, our next Sunday is Communion Sunday, so there will not be any class next week. I get a little bit of extra time to get ready for the next one. We'll have our class, what is it, the 14th? I think all of our Sundays in December are multiples of 7. So we'll have our class the 14th. I don't know if there is a class scheduled for the 21st, because that will be a combined, okay, Mike is saying there's no class scheduled. So we will only have 2 classes next month. So the 14th we'll be going over moral law, or that question of why does God allow suffering. And the 28th we will start to get into the history of the Bible. That one is going to be focused kind of more so on an Old Testament perspective, and then when we come back the second week of January, we will start getting into more of the New Testament as far as history and everything goes. So again, if you are missing any of the materials that have been handed out so far, I had said come see me afterwards, but I'm going to say come see me after the 10:30 service, because I have other things I have to go do yet this morning. Brother Eddie?
2 thoughts came to my mind, well, more than that, but 2 that I'll share. One, that famous line, I think, therefore I am. And also, who is that I am? And that power of thought, or the idea of thought, and where are thoughts born, has always intrigued me. The other is on the idea of aesthetics, and I recall a testimony, a story that Brother Arthur Oakman shared a time or two about a young girl who was sitting on her mother's lap, getting ready for bed, and admiring her. Said, "Mother, you're so beautiful. Your hair is so pretty, and your face, your eyes are so beautiful, and Mother, everything about you is beautiful except your hands. Your hands are terribly hideous." And her mother said, "Well, I'll tell you what happened. When you were a baby, your crib caught fire, and I heard your screams, and I ran into your bedroom and attempted to put the fire out, and my hands were burned, and now they're scarred, like forever." And she said, well, she thought about that for a few minutes and then went to bed, and several weeks later was going through the same process. "Mother, you're so beautiful, your eyes and your hair, your face, but Mother, the most beautiful thing about you are your hands." And her ability to comprehend the sacrifice that was made for her, which caused that hideous scarring, that the reasoning, even in the minds of a child, bear witness to the spirit, which each of us are given at birth, which I think differentiates us from all of the millions of species. That's all.
Yeah, that I think, therefore I am is another aspect of that whole problem of our reason, our rationality, that the universe is decipherable in the first place. Because when Hume said that, he was deconstructing basically everything, and he came to the conclusion that the only thing he could be certain of, because my eyes can be deceived, my hearing, my touch, all of our senses are capable of being deceived and therefore can't be trusted. So the only thing he could be certain, he could trust in, was true, was I think, therefore I am. His own existence, because of his own thoughts, were the only thing that he could be confident in. So again, that question of why is the universe something that is understandable, measurable, studyable, etc., in the first place, there is no complete and logically consistent answer to be offered in the theory that life originated via abiogenesis. So we've gone a couple minutes over already, but we will see you back in a couple of weeks.